First, we're submitting written testimony co-signed by 24 by my Senate colleagues. This testimony expressed our deep concern about the current requirements for family access to emergency shelter. The regulations for which this hearing is being held represent a significant change in who is eligible for shelter, and we believe they must be modified to protect our state's most vulnerable children. The written testimony outlines several areas within the regulations that we feel pose a threat to families who need shelter. These include changes that no longer allow shelter access for those who are homeless and fall under the classic definition of no fault. The written testimony also cites concerns regarding the changes in the usage of the sanitary code as a measure for whether a housing unit meets the definition of substandard, as well as concern for the small amount of resources and lack of affordable housing to support families who seek to stay in their homes or obtain stable housing they can afford. But the issue I want to focus on today is this issue of imminent risk. Families across the Commonwealth are being required to sleep in places unfit for human habitation before DHCD will even consider them for emergency shelter. There appears to be no guarantee that those families will receive shelter, and currently no guarantee that the process for determining eligibility in these cases will be clear, consistent, and compassionate. I believe this situation presents a danger to families and deserves our immediate attention and action. During the budget process, I and a handful of senators worked thoughtfully with the Senate Ways and Means and the administration to craft language that protected children in need and their families while at the same time acknowledging the budget constraints facing the Commonwealth. One, our intent was made perfectly clear. The intent was that any legislation or regulation should protect children and their families from spending even one night without safe shelter, and we deliberately chose language to reflect that intent. Furthermore, there was no doubt that DHCD was well aware of both the intent and the spirit of the budget line language. In fact, during the budget process, we received assurances that both the spirit and the intent would be reflected in the regulations. Regrettably, after the budget passed, DHCD published new regulations that are not reflective of our intent or our strong desire to ensure that these protections. In subsequent conversations with DHCD, where the issue of imminent risk of homelessness has been raised a number of times, DHCD has responded to our concerns by stating that, one, the regulations are based on the new eligibility requirements outlined in the budget and new categories cannot be added. And two, DHCD has stated that it is costly to change the regulations to deal with imminent risk, that it reopens the shelter system. To the first point, as I have stated before, this is simply not true. The language was carefully written to ensure that the categories of eligibility outlined were not exhaustive and should not be treated as such. The language clearly allows for additional categories to be added if that is necessary to protect our residents. To the second point, that this is costly. This response is deeply concerning. Yes, it is costly to provide temporary shelter, and yes, we should have affordable housing for our residents, but we don't. And where do we suggest those families go if all other housing is unavailable to them? Come back when you can prove you're homeless cannot be a policy of the state of Massachusetts when children have no shelter. But this is exactly the policy we are creating when we refuse to presumptively give families shelter when they're at imminent risk of spending the night in a place unfit for human habitation. And that is unacceptable, for it does not reflect our intent, our values, or who we are. And how much more costly is it to serve children who do not have a roof over their head and find themselves in unsafe situations night after night? How many more times must we be told about the damaging effects on children's health, ability to learn, and future development before we take to heart that doing nothing will cost them and our state much more than the cost of emergency shelter. We all share the goal of ensuring affordable, safe, and permanent housing to the children of the Commonwealth and their families. Our number one priority should be to create and support programs that aid eligible families in securing housing. However, because of the past experience and the uncertainty surrounding the success of new policies and programs, we do not support regulations that leave the last shelter safety net in tatters, or that set the threshold so high that some families will have no safe place to sleep at night. We believe, based on past experience and the experience of families since the change of policy, that these regulations do not strike the correct balance between bureaucratic accountability and human compassion. If and when we have programs and enough affordable housing to support those in need, our homeless shelters will be empty. If not, children in need and their families will still require a safe place to sleep. We cannot make it impossible for them to access the safety net. We strongly urge you to adopt the modifications outlined in our written testimony, including that of imminent risk. Thank you.